On this episode of Newt's World, in his new book, The Invisible Coup, Peter Schweizer, the best-selling investigative journalist of our time, is blowing the lid off a whole series of schemes. For decades, establishment elites sold us the story of immigration as a compassionate renewal of the American dream within a harmonious melting pot. But beneath that narrative lies a different reality. Mass migration has morphed into the most powerful political weapon ever aimed at the United States, one engineered by elites at home and aided by adversaries abroad. Backed by years of forensic fieldwork and a trove of confidential documents and intercepted communications, linking political leaders, global non-governmental organizations, and even drug cartels, Schweizer detonates a political shockwave. Peter, welcome, and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Always great to be with you, Newt. Thanks so much for having me.
You are remarkable in the books I've read over the years. You have this ability to investigate that's very rare, and you do it really well. In Invisible Coup, you argue that immigration itself isn't the problem, but that America's generosity is being turned against us. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about immigration in this country, we tend to look back 100 years, even 50 years, and see it as largely this organic movement of people who are seeking a better life, who want to embrace the American dream. What we're experiencing today is what I call weaponized migration. Yes, you do have people that are still coming to the United States with those aspirations, but it's really being directed by these foreign governments and foreign organizations that when the migrants come here, they not only bring themselves, their family, their culture, and their language, they also bring with them political networks. And our adversaries and enemies are exploiting this. They don't want immigrants to come here and assimilate. There are a lot of NGOs, organizations that don't want them to assimilate. And they see this as a weapon, as it were, to be used against the United States. And they actually had a test run back in 1980 with the Mariel boatlift. And that really inspired, I think, a lot of what we're facing today.
I remember this. I was a freshman in Congress, and it actually defeated, or was a big factor in defeating Bill Clinton for re-election to governor, because a number of those people ended up in a prison in Arkansas, and Arkansans were just furious. I think this is so seminal. Can you just take a minute or two and explain the context of the Mariel boatlift and how it happened?
The Mariel boatlift happened in the spring of 1980, and essentially there was discontent in Fidel Castro's Cuba. Some people wanted to go. There was a small trickle of people that were leaving, and Jimmy Carter announced that he was going to welcome them with open arms, to which Fidel Castro retorted that I'm going to fill his arms with human excrement. I won't use the word that Castro used. And what they did was they opened up the prisons. They opened up these psychiatric wards. They got intelligence officers and embedded them within the Mariel boatlift. So it arrived in the United States where, yes, there were some refugees, but there are also a lot of psychopaths, a lot of criminals, criminal gang organizations that have been established, and intelligence officers that were doing the bidding of the Cuban government. And that summer of 1980, when this was unfolding, Fidel Castro went to Nicaragua, Managua, Nicaragua, and met with Daniel Ortega, who had been in power for basically a year. And there were other leftists from Latin America there as well, including Lula da Silva, the now president of Brazil. Back then, he was a radical activist. And Castro recounted to Ortega and Lula and others the great success he was having in the weaponization of immigration. What's interesting, I think, is that both Daniel Ortega and Lula would figure very large in what happened under Joe Biden, the mass exodus that came to the United States. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, created this stepping stone where it's estimated maybe 1.5 million people from around the world flew to Managua and then would walk up and cross the American border. But to put this in strategic context terms, Newt, there was a study done by federal and state officials looking at the most successful attacks on the United States in American history. Their conclusion was the three most successful attacks were the 9/11 strike, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the third one was the Mariel boatlift in terms of the sheer damage and violence that it caused in the United States. But what's interesting, Newt, when you look at those three incidents, what happened after 9/11? We basically destroyed Al-Qaeda. What happened after Pearl Harbor? We destroyed the Japanese Empire. What happened after the Mariel boatlift? Nothing. Because when you use migration as a weapon, there's nothing really to bomb. That's what makes it, I think, such a powerful tool and why it is being deployed against us today.
One of the points you make is way beyond Cuba, that there are now 50 consulates, or more than 50 consulates, of Mexico scattered across the United States. To what extent is this a conscious Mexican strategy to try to, in effect, infiltrate the American system?
I think it is a conscious effort. I'll tell you, one of the most startling things in my research that I ran across were dozens of statements from senior Mexican officials about how they view mass migration. I want to read a couple of them, Newt, just because, to make clear, this is not me positing this. This is not a hypothesis. This is what they say. The first one is from a December 2024 report by Gabriela Rodriguez in an official report, one of the top advisors to President Sheinbaum of Mexico. She wrote, quote, "We already know that the Mexican population in the United States reaches 39.9 million. We Mexicans are reclaiming our territory." Or this other one from a Mexican Senator, Salgado. He is a senior senator. He sits on the National Defense Committee, which is the most powerful committee in the Mexican Senate. He's with the Morena party, the ruling party. He says, and I quote, "Mexicans are in our territory: California, Nevada, Texas, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Wyoming. We're going to take back the territory that was stolen from us." I could read dozens of quotes like that to you from senior people in Mexico. And when I first ran across these, Newt, I thought, this is just bravado, right? This is just sort of making exaggerated claims. But then when you look at the infrastructure that Mexico has in the United States and how they're using that infrastructure, it's very clear that they are already exerting elements of sovereignty within the borders of the United States. So what do I mean by that? One of the things I discovered is that Mexico has in the United States more than a dozen senators and members of the Chamber of Deputies, their Congress, elected Mexican officials who live inside the United States. Why do they live inside the United States? Because their job is to represent Mexicans living in our borders before the Mexican parliament. That, to me, is a clear intrusion into our sovereignty. And I think as part of this effort to reclaim the United States, do they think California is going to become a state of Mexico? I don't know. One of these migrant senators has introduced a bill suggesting just that, but they clearly believe that allows them to establish greater political sovereignty and influence within the United States. In addition to this network of elected officials, they also have this vast network of consulates. The United Kingdom and China have 6 and 7 consulates, respectively, in the United States. Mexico has 53. In fact, they have 4 in Arizona, which is almost as many as the UK has in the entire country. And what I discovered is that these consulates, in addition to, stamping visas, they are involved in domestic partisan politics in the United States. They're actively working to prevent Trump from achieving his objectives. They actively work to try to prevent his election in 2024. And there's evidence that these consular officials are involved in these anti-ICE protests. So Mexico very clearly has taken steps to try to make the migrants in the United States into a political force that can be beneficial to what they call Greater Mexico.
I mean, you're describing sort of a strategy which doesn't recognize national borders.
Correct. In fact, one of the things that President Sheinbaum has done is she had commissioned a song called The Migrant Hymn. And this is a song specifically about Mexican migrants moving to the United States. And it explicitly says, like the eagle flies without borders, we don't recognize any borders. And it's a call to migrants in the United States to assert their Mexican nationalism. In addition to doing that, Newt, Sheinbaum's government created something called Migrant TV or Migrante TV, which is a streaming news service run by the Mexican government specifically targeted at migrants in the United States. And I recount some of the content of that in the book. 2024 election, they did a soft launch. Very, very pro-Kamala Harris, very, very negative to President Trump. Since President Trump has been in the White House, they have run very aggressive stories about ICE and federal law enforcement being fascists and brown shirts. So this is really over-the-top stuff that the Mexican government itself is doing within our borders. And you're right, they are completely disregarding national borders and national autonomy.
To what extent did Biden dramatically worsen the situation?
He did so in a couple of ways, Newt. The first thing he did was he opened the borders. He instructed Border Patrol to not prevent people from entering the country. When he won in 2020, when he was declared the winner in November of 2020, days after that, the Mexican Senate and their Chamber of Deputies passed a series of bills that they knew would heighten the flood of people coming north of the border. And when Biden came in, he allowed them in. So the Biden policies were absolutely key in opening up the floodgates. And as I mentioned earlier, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, after Joe Biden was declared the winner in November 2020, sent out to the world, you can charter a flight, come to Nicaragua, pay us a fee, $50 for a visa. We will drive you to the northern border, get you on your way so you can enter the United States. And it's believed more than 1.5 million people from Africa, the Caribbean, from Asia did just that. There were planes taking off and landing, chartered flights constantly into Managua's airport. And again, the Biden administration really did nothing to stem that flow. And as I lay out in the book, I think that is for political reasons. The Democrats realize there is an enormous political necessity for them in having mass migration.
It's almost like they overreached. And so the country then finally did react. The country reacted decisively, and then the Trump administration was, at least for me as a historian, it was astonishing to watch the speed with which they closed the border. I would not have thought it was possible.
It was miraculous in a way, and of course demonstrated how the claims that you can't close the border, that it's not really something we can control, is ridiculous. And I think the Trump administration deserves enormous credit for that. I think, yes, the flood of people was so great that it was impossible for ordinary Americans who don't even pay attention to politics to allow it to continue. So it was a massive overreach.
You know, we did a podcast a while back with a mayor of a small town in Arizona, which fits one of your points. They actually had like 100,000 people from India who've crossed the U.S.-Mexico border just in 2023. Well, this mayor is talking about the fact that these are well-dressed people. They drive up to the border. They have really nice luggage with wheels. They pull it across the border. Has no resemblance to anything I'd ever thought about in terms of migration. But the way in which Noriega had set it up, there's a steady stream that comes out of Asia and Africa and comes across below us and then turns and comes north. That's cut off right now. But there was really a huge number of people from literally all around the world who were coming in under Biden.
The Nicaraguan air gate, so to speak, I mean, there were chartered flights from Cameroon. I mean, word hit the streets in Cameroon, and they were chartering airplanes that were flying to Nicaragua. And again, the Biden administration knew this was going on, made a decision to not resist and seal the border, and the effects were dramatic. And this benefited our adversaries because, of course, in addition to 100,000 Indians, there were at least that many Chinese that came across the border. And, of course, Venezuela and other adversarial countries were replaying the Mariel boatlift. Within this flood of people that, as you said, they were oftentimes well-dressed and it was so well-organized, you also had the criminal networks, the intelligence operatives, the military personnel as well, that were embedded within the torrent that was coming north.
In that process, we've at least stopped it for the moment, but we still have millions of people already inside the border. I mean, what is your sense about, can we, in fact, as a matter of practicality, deport all of them, or what do you think will happen?
It's a good question. I think that what we need to do is, ICE has been focusing on the criminal networks, which I think is good. And then I think we need to look at the broader issue of deportations. But even more important than that, Newt, is we need to dismantle these political networks that have been erected within our country. We were talking about Mexico earlier with these 53 consulates. There was, for example, a meeting in May of 2024 at the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma Mexican consulate. They brought diplomats from the consulate from Los Angeles to Orlando and everybody in between. They flew in senior people from Mexico City. The foreign minister of Mexico addressed the crowd. Also in the crowd with the diplomats were Democratic Party political operatives. And we have a transcript of that meeting. And the conversation was, we turned California from red to blue. We turned Arizona from red to blue. How can we turn the rest of the country from red to blue? And how can we stop Donald Trump from being elected? That is not the sort of thing that diplomats are supposed to be engaged in. In addition to that, they are working with a lot of NGOs on political activism. And you have these officials, these Mexican officials in the United States involved in organizing these raucous, sometimes violent anti-ICE protests. One of the people I mentioned in the book is one of these Mexican congressmen who lives apparently in Ontario, California, senior Morena Party official, who in 2025 was traveling across the United States trying to organize migrants, linking with Antifa-type groups. And he said that his role was to, quote, organize the militancy against Donald Trump. This is foreign interference on a vast scale. So we need to not just look at reducing the number of migrants. We really need to focus on destroying these political networks. And I think we have to fundamentally tackle this issue of birthright citizenship, particularly in light of the vast scale of what the Chinese are doing to exploit it.
You suggest that in 2018 alone, there were 150,000 people who came from China to the U.S. to practice what you describe as birth tourism?
Yeah. This is a number that a Chinese-based research firm came up with. Birth tourism is this idea that if you happen to give birth to a child in the United States, that child is automatically granted U.S. citizenship. The Chinese Communist Party in 2011 ran a series of articles in the People's Daily, their main newspaper. And the articles were directed at the members of the Chinese Communist Party elite. And it was explaining to them how you should do this, how you can get U.S. citizenship for your children by simply transporting your wife to the United States, having her give birth. When the child is old enough to travel, a couple of weeks, fly them back to China. They'll be U.S. citizens, but you can raise them here in China, which begs the question, which is not answered in the article, why would the Chinese Communist Party be encouraging its elite to do so? So this has been going on for a while. We in the United States don't track numbers. Our federal government has no idea how many people have done this because when you have a birth certificate that's issued by local authorities, it does not list the citizenship of the parents. So nobody's tracking this here. China, the government and research firms there have been tracking this birth tourism industry, which involves thousands of companies in China, and the numbers that they offer are horrifying. You mentioned the one estimate by the research firm that in 2018 alone, 150,000 Chinese babies were born in the United States, then returned to China to be raised there, even though they're U.S. citizens. The Chinese government and other research firms believe that every single year from 2013 to now, roughly 100,000 on average, Chinese babies are being born in the United States, which means if you do the math, you're looking at more than 1 million U.S. citizens, and I'm going to put U.S. citizens in air quotes because they just were born here. They're being raised there. But when they turn 18, they're going to be able to vote. They're going to be able to contribute to political campaigns. They're going to be able to apply for sensitive government jobs. This is a systematic industrial scale exploitation of our birthright citizenship issue, and it needs to be addressed because it's a serious national security concern.
I gather you would be for some kind of limitation on birthright citizenship.
Yes. And my view is, Newt, I don't know where the lines are. I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me if you are somebody that came to the United States, you've lived here for 20 years, you've worked, you've paid your taxes, you've been responsible, and your child was born here and has lived here and is being raised here, that's one thing. What's happening in China is not the case. They're not even being raised here. The moment they are ready to travel on an airplane, they are being returned to China. The problem, by the way, is compounded by an additional practice that the CCP has encouraged, which is surrogacy. In this particular case, Chinese elites will hire an American woman, pay her $50,000 to $60,000 to carry the child of the Chinese man, or in some cases, they will donate sperms and eggs from a woman, and she will carry the child. But in those particular cases, we have no idea the scale. But again, that child is born in the United States. It's now also got a biological American parent, so it's going to be a U.S. citizen. The Wall Street Journal had a piece 5 or 6 weeks ago on the front page where they found one senior CCP official, a Chinese billionaire, who has more than 100 children born this way. They're being raised in China. And in our research, we found in just Southern California, 107 Chinese-owned surrogacy firms that are advertising in China these services for Chinese nationals. So this is a massive problem. And yeah, we've got to stop this. I have one toe in the United States, ergo, my child is going to be a U.S. citizen with all the rights and privileges. That is just crazy.
Has Congress held hearings on the scale of the Chinese industry?
Funny you mentioned that. Senator Schmidt from Missouri has asked me to testify before the Judiciary Committee. I think it's March 10th or 12th. So we will be addressing that. We met in the Oval Office with the President, with the Secretary of State, and with the Treasury Secretary for about 55 minutes going through these issues. We met with senior leadership on Capitol Hill, including Jim Comer from Kentucky, the chairman of House Oversight. So we are expecting to see movement, and we have reason to believe, based on the follow-up conversations, that the scale of what China is doing and the methods by which they are doing is going to be incorporated into the discussions at the Supreme Court, which I think is very important.
This is so different than the world that, say, Abraham Lincoln lived in. So trying to go back and stretch the 14th Amendment to somehow include this, I think Lincoln would have thought was insane.
Yeah.
You also are very concerned about dual citizenship. Explain that.
Yeah, so dual citizenship is the idea that you can be an American citizen and be a Chinese citizen, or be an American citizen and a Mexican citizen. And this is something that is kind of new in American history. There was a Supreme Court case in the 1960s where a gentleman sued the federal government saying that he could be a dual citizen, and the Supreme Court agreed and affirmed that he could. I think this is a huge mistake. I think that citizenship is something that should mean that you have loyalty to that one country of which you are a citizen. And the notion that you could be a citizen of Mexico and the United States and you're only going to put American interests first, I think is a ridiculous notion. So I would argue that we need to reform that. The Supreme Court made this designation. It doesn't mean that it can't be revisited, and I think it should.
you're describing an American national security vulnerability that I would never have dreamed of, both in terms of the number of foreign diplomats, not just Mexican, who are actively engaged in our politics, and then second, in both grand strategies of dumping dangerous people here and grand strategies of creating a generation of birthright citizens whose loyalty is explicitly not to the United States. I mean, when you put those things together, that's pretty extraordinary.
It is. And it's why I believe this is the biggest national security threat we face. It's not the only one. We need to make sure that our military capabilities are real. We need to make sure that we are effectively competing with China and beating China in AI. But this, I think, this weaponization of immigration, which, by the way, was used historically. It's been used historically many times, but was demonstrated as successful on a limited test case basis with the Mariel boatlift, has now been employed on a massive scale. And what's happening, Newt, is that there are domestic actors who reject the traditional notions of immigration to the United States. So what do I mean by that? The idea of assimilation. Assimilation is foundational. My parents were immigrants from Europe. A lot of us can recount people we know that came to the United States, embraced American values. There is an active industry among NGOs from foreign government officials telling people, no, this is wrong. Do not assimilate. Alejandro Robles, who I mentioned earlier, this Mexican government official, did an interview with Morena officials last year where he said that Mexicans that come to the United States and Americanize and adopt American values are traitors to Mexico. And he went on to say that President Sheinbaum agrees with him. And again, he was the head of international operations for the Morena Party, which is her party. You find the same thing with Islamist groups like CARE, an organization you've talked about before, Newt, the Council for American Islamic Relations, a very powerful lobby group in the United States. I quote numerous senior officials from CARE saying, we can never accept this system in the United States. Our job is not to become Americans. It's not to assimilate. Our job is to change America politically and spiritually. So when you're dealing with these kinds of advocates within the United States, in addition to senior Obama administration officials who say the same thing, you have this enormous gap between the public perception of what immigration means and the reality in which it plays out on the ground. And you have the ugly reality that a person today who comes to America, adopts American values, lives the American dream, is doing so despite the efforts of other governments and NGOs. And that is not a good place for us to be.
I've had the feeling that in many ways we are teetering on a brink between a country which has been amazingly successful and countervailing forces, both foreign and domestic, who literally want to replace that entire model. They're not asking to compete within the model. They want to replace it.
Newt, I begin the book talking about the posit Clash of Civilizations, which was a major book 20 or 30 years ago. And that was written in the context of a clash of civilizations on a global scale. This is happening around the world. The Clash of Civilizations is now occurring within the borders of the United States. And that is the way that these countries view it. China, I quote several officials in the book, it's not just that they are competing with the United States for spheres of influence, for military superiority, for economic dominance. This is a civilizational conflict. They view it. This is a civilizational war, the defining issues of how society should be organized, what it values, what is true, and what is important. The same thing, in a strange way, applies to Mexico. We think of Mexico as sort of part of the Western world, but the reality in recent years, particularly under the Morena Party, there has been pushback against the Spanish ancestry, the rejection of the Spanish part of Mexico's history, to the extent that they have asked for an apology from the Spanish king for all the crimes that Spain committed in Mexico. And there's been an embracing of these sort of indigenous values. Now, I'm not suggesting that they are Aztecs today, but they clearly are rejecting the notion of Western values. And what they usually talk about in the United States is sort of the Anglo-Saxon world. They use that phrase derisively. So they have a very different view of how society should be organized, not to mention groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is foundational. This is a civilizational war that is being played out within the borders of the United States. That is the war that you're seeing on the streets of Minneapolis and that we saw on the streets of Los Angeles last year.
I sort of understand that Islam is a huge religion and has a whole set of core values. But when you look at Mexico, if you're talking about giving up both American and European values, what is the positive version of Mexicanness that they would replace it with?
There's a book that was written in 1925 called The Cosmic Race. It's by the gentleman that was the founder of the Mexican educational system. And The Cosmic Race describes Latin America in the context of indigenous natives fused with some values from Spain. But it talks about the cosmic competition between that body and North America, which they view as representing Europe, the values of the Enlightenment. So what does this have to do with the struggle today? That book remains enormously popular with the Mexican elite. AMLO, the mentor to current President Sheinbaum, the former president of Mexico, AMLO, praised this author and the values that it embraced. The organization named La Raza, which recently changed its name, but La Raza, they named their organization after this book, The Cosmic Race. And that book presents a vision of the two contrary views of human nature. And of course, their vision is collectivist. It is center-controlled. It is by a dominant authority. It is forced egalitarianism in the context of distribution of resources. It is a vastly different vision than the American view that we have had really since our founding.
That's pretty sobering if that's a major competitor for how our future is going to evolve. And candidly, I'm not sure how many Americans would favor it if they understood that.
This is the key, right? The key is for us to alert people to what's going on. That's why I try doing the book in their words. But it's also to continue to reaffirm, as you've done over your career and other people, continuing to reaffirm what is valuable and true and right about American values, because they are unique. When immigrants come to this country, you need to make a conscious choice to adopt the values, to adopt the cognitive assumptions behind the Western way of life, because it is unique. It is different from the rest of the world. And if you don't make that decision, you are bringing your culture, and your culture is probably from a failed state, because many people are coming from collapsed societies. So we need to continue to encourage assimilation. I still believe in immigration, but we've got to deal with the weaponization of immigration by these actors before we can have the conversation of what should the level of legal immigration be.
I really want to thank you, because you've raised, just in our conversation today, a number of issues that are so important to the survival of America and are so different than the things we've had covered. I found this to be an extraordinarily helpful conversation. I want to thank you for joining me. You are an amazing investigative reporter. Your work has consistently been groundbreaking. Your new book, The Invisible Coup, is available on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I'm certainly going to encourage my friends in Congress and the news media to take seriously the kind of investigations that your book sort of lays out and suggests we have to have for our very survival. So thank you both for your career, for your work, for this book, and for joining me in Newt's World.
It's always a pleasure, Newt, to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you to my guest, Peter Schweizer. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Carnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.